For decades, Australian films have presented a very specific image of what an Australian might look like. One that is tough, rebellious, and more often than not, white. Characters like Barry McKenzie, Crocodile Dundee, and even Kenny embodied what Benito Cow calls the larrikin, a figure defined by a cheeky disregard for authority and colonial influence. These films showcase a distinctly white, male, and often homogenous portrayal of Australian identity. Barry McKenzie, for example, is the quintessential larrikin, a crude, sadistical character whose antics highlight a desire to distance himself from the previous British colonialism. At the same time, Crocodile Dundee romanticizes the wild Australian outback, turning the larrikin into a lovable, charismatic hero. And even Kenny introduced a more grounded, relatable version of the idea of this larrikin, yet still holds on to that sense of Australian irreverence. And then there's the setting. Often it's Australia's vast outback, which has long been portrayed as this perfect backdrop for national identity. Films like Gallipoli highlight the grandness of the Australian landscape, aligning it with values like freedom and mateship. But even this grand outback landscape has evolved over the years. One key way Australian national identity has been represented on screen is through its plots. Take They're a Weird Mob, a film about an Italian immigrant named Nino trying to navigate life in Australia in 1960. The film is filled with many cultural misunderstandings, with Nino's attempts at fitting in being played out as comedic.
Please, do you mind using me the courtesy of telling me where now I am?
The cross, 3 Bob.
Yes, thank you, sir, but I wish to know where I am now.
King's Bloody Cross.
Although Nino is ultimately embraced by his Australian colleagues, the film positions him as a symbol of assimilation, a typical migrant who learns the Australian way of life. But it's important to consider how this story, while optimistic, overlooks the real struggles faced by many migrants at that time and to this day. And moreover, it is a story told from the point of view of a white Australian. This includes the idea that while many of these stories are progressive towards the idea of national identity, more often than not, they were told from the POV of a white Australian male. Fast forward to Looking for Alibrandi, a film about a second-generation Italian-Australian teen, Josephine, navigating her cultural identity. Unlike Nino, Josephine's journey isn't simply about assimilating into the mainstream Australian culture. Instead, it's about accepting her multicultural heritage and reconciling it with her own sense of self.
You might think this is all quirky and cute, but I actually find this really embarrassing. I mean, you'd think they'd never left Sicily except that it was like 50 years ago.
As Australia's society has become more multicultural, filmmakers have begun to reflect on this diversity in their stories. Post-World War II immigration saw waves of Italian, Greek and other migrant groups calling Australia home. Films that reflect these immigrant experiences not only entertain but challenge Australian audiences to rethink what it means to be Australian. It is no longer limited to one story or one identity. Australian cinema has played a pivotal role in defining and reshaping national identity. Through the years, we've witnessed a shift from the idealised outback and the themes of mateship to a more complex understanding of identity, one that is urban, diverse, and constantly in evolution. More recently, films with protagonists from these groups represent a new Australian realism, a more grounded, truthful depiction of Australian life, often reflecting the struggles of today's community. This shift reflects not just the aesthetic change, but one of a broader cultural conversation about who we are and how we see ourselves. Contemporary Australian cinema has moved far beyond those old stereotypes, from the larrikin hero in the outback to a more nuanced portrayal of someone living in an urbanised world. Australian films now present a more inclusive vision of national identity. They challenge us to consider who we are, how far we've come, and where we're heading in an increasingly globalised world.
Oh, what a boy tricks to the news, kick it down flat to the grass. Have your balls turn the bicycle wheels and back pedal up your ass.
I hope the right honourable member will permit me to give him the drum.
Go and dip your left eye in hot cocky shit. Go and dip your left eye in hot cocky shit. Go and dip your left eye in hot cocky shit. Stick your head up.